Welcome on a Wednesday night to Generation Movie. My name is JW Colwell. I am joined, as always, by the most incredible co-host a guy could have, and friend, Rich Drees of FILMBUFF Online, and so many other things. Rich, how are you on this Wednesday night? We've already talked tonight, but how are you on this Wednesday night? How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been a good week movie-wise.
I was thinking about this. You called me a handsome gentleman earlier, so I went and shaved because I was looking at how grubby I looked on Loud and Nerdy. So I shaved, so I look like,
Now you're making me look bad that I didn't.
Yeah, well, you said I looked handsome. I was like, I don't look handsome at all.
And usually I do shave too before this.
Yeah, but that's okay. You had a busy week. It has been a busy week. Now we are in the middle of BOND-A-THON 2023. Tonight is GOLDENEYE. Very excited about that. And then we get into our last Bond next week. You also have some big screenings coming up next week. So next week is probably going to be a taped episode. Want to let everybody know that in advance.
My screenings are Monday and Thursday, I think. Let me double check my calendar right now.
Okay.
Monday and Thursday.
I am totally wrong then. We will be live next week. But we should talk about a little bit, like we're on my show, Loud and Nerdy earlier. We talked a little bit of the AMC thing. I don't want to do the same thing. I want to talk a little bit about, there was a major announcement by Disney today. Disney had its earnings call today. And Bob Iger's back, and there's some continuity and there's some excitement with the company. Not creatively, there's not a lot of excitement because one of the main announcements today was that there are going to be sequels to Toy Story, which has now ended twice with really good movies. Toy Story 3, they've avoided certain doom twice, right? Because Toy Story 3 is really good, and Toy Story 4, while everybody was worried that it was going to ruin Toy Story 3, didn't, and they ended up finding a poignant ending for the franchise. And now Iger announces today at a giant call that they're doing Toy Story 5. They also announced they're going to do Frozen 3. Again, similar. You have $1 billion movie with $1 billion song. You make a sequel. You avoid the traps. The sequel does as well and is as well received as the original. And you're going to make a third one, which is okay. It's a license to print money, but it's also like, how many snowman jokes can you tell? And then there's a sequel to a movie called Zootopia, which is a fantastically subversive and dark animated movie that has a lot more in common with LA Confidential than it does with Frozen or Toy Story. I go look. There's a lot of similarities between LA Confidential and Zootopia. They're making a sequel to Zootopia, but they've already done a show that's on Disney Plus that's like a sequel show. So but all of these movies grossed about $7 billion, which is all the reason anybody needs to go back to that well. My concern, and I have a question for you, is
okay.
Are you concerned about the creative well? That's the well
Yes.
I'm concerned about, because these are great movies.
My big question for Bob Iger in this moment is, have you ever heard of the phrase pushing your luck? Because
yeah,
he's pushing a lot of chips onto those 3 squares on the board. And
well, I think he has other chips that he has, but he's not worried about them. He's not worried about the Marvel chips, right? He's not worried about the Star Wars chips. They're falling pretty reasonable. The Marvel, we're going to have 3 Marvel movies this year and a ton of shows. So he doesn't have to worry about those. But like the animated side of things, Strange World, they're coming off of one of their first big tanker films since, the mid-90s?
Yeah. Strange World was okay, though.
Strange World was great, actually.
Okay.
I had a really good time at Strange World. For an uncle of 2 little boys, we went to it and were mesmerized by all the creatures, and it was very sci-fi.
The imagination on display in Strange World is great. I thought their story beats were fairly
wonky.
Standard for most of
They were wonky. They were a little, and they were. It's a weird movie, but I enjoyed it. And the 6-year-old I was with, and the 5-year-old I was with, thoroughly enjoyed it. Enjoyed the big creatures and the giant monsters and the liquid splash things. And so I came out of that movie going, okay. And it's about guys, right? It's about people trying to get over their problems with fathers and problems with sons, and so it's kind of a cool movie. But it's a tanker. They didn't market it right. It didn't go well. And now you come back and go, I'm going to go right back to the trough, the feeding trough of animation, which is Toy Story.
I'm going to throw up a flag on this play here first, a penalty flag here. You said they didn't market it well. That implies that they tried marketing it at all, which I don't think they did.
Well, so you can throw a flag, but what I'm saying is when you say market something well, that includes actually marketing it.
Okay. I'm being semantical. Sorry.
You are. You're screwing me on that one, but that's okay. But my take on it was, when I say not marketed well, I mean nobody knew what the hell it was, and and they didn't do anything to help that. Because I desperately, you know what I wanted when they were doing the marketing for that movie? I desperately wanted an old-timey newsreel type radio, like old-timey trailer. Strange World, because that's how I was reading it to the nephews, right? I'm sitting there going,
it is a big pulpy throwback that, maybe they should have leaned into it, or somebody said, well,
it's a tanker fire. Let's go.
Captain didn't do well as a big pulpy throwback, so maybe we don't market it as that, which again is the stupidity of
I just think it's in general. I'm not concerned about Frozen, right? Frozen 3 movies is, you can generally get 3 good movies out of something. I'm concerned about Toy Story, because Toy Story has had 2 legitimately well done ending films where you go, they don't need to do anymore, because their characters are at perfect spots in time. Unless you're going to radically do something really crazy, like go 40 years into the future or something mind-bogglingly crazy. I don't know. Zootopia, I could do with a sequel, but I also think it's a mystery film with animals that once the mystery's over, again, you can't remake LA Confidential. I don't know where you go with this. And then all it does is open up for Zootopia. It's the weird. For me, what I think is funny about Zootopia is that it's opened up all these wonky sexual things with rabbits and foxes and furry kind of stuff. And they don't even know it's that.
You just flat out buy the film rights to all of the James Ellroy Los Angeles Quartet novels and do The Big Scare. And you do the Black Dahlia as a Zootopia movie. I want to see that. Fuck it, do
just a lamb that gets murdered out in the middle of the field. Yeah, in Zootopia.
Fugitive as a Zootopia movie. Do the Maltese Falcon as a Zootopia movie. if you kind of got this format where you could go and you could take classic detective story tropes and have a good time with them.
Okay,
Get crazy.
so we got some comments. Opening comments. Tim Snyder joins us.
Hiya, Tim.
Excellent, loud and nerdy earlier. Thank you, Tim. You get a double dose. It's like a double feature. You get Rich and I twice. I even changed the shirt for you, Tim. People who watched the earlier show, I changed my shirt.
Same here.
And so did Rich. We're doing wardrobe duties now. Joe types in, "Good evening, gentlemen. Starting Poker Face after this is over." Oh, Joe,
you're in for a treat.
You're in for a treat, Joe. I would ask you, and this is fun. We can talk about this for a couple minutes too. The magic of Poker Face is especially, and you're right in that age range. If you watched Columbo with your old man or your grandfather, or your grandmother, or mother, or family members, and you watch Columbo, and you were young and you watch Columbo, and you're like, "Oh my God, they love it so much," and then I don't actually understand it. Then you watched it later in life, and you go, "Okay, I get why Columbo's amazing." Poker Face is in the same vein. It's beautifully written. It is amazingly acted. And the beauty of the episodes is in the intricate mechanics of how everything plays out. Like my wife, and you're going to understand this phrase, and Rich will understand this phrase. My wife and I have started talking before we watch a Poker Face episode. Where will she show up? What is she going to be? Where will she come into this story? Mm-hmm. Where will it happen? And where will the magic begin? And then it happens, and you're just like, and we introduced my aunt to it last week. It's one of the best shows going, and Rian Johnson is an incredible writer, and the talent involved. Natasha Lyonne is on a creative firestroke right now where she's just pushing all her chips in. She's got this. She's got Russian Doll, which is phenomenal. Kind of a Groundhog Day for the modern age, and just beautiful. And this show is.
And if you're not familiar with Columbo, but you find yourself really enjoying Poker Face, Columbo's I believe available. Peacock also has Columbo.
They put all the Columbo episodes right next to it.
Yeah,
right next to it, Rich. It's you want to start going back and watching Columbo outfox a bunch of really great aged guest stars from the 70s. You can watch a bunch of and the structure is very, very similar. But Joe, when you get through a couple of the episodes, I'd like to know what you think. There are some really great episodes in the first 5. Like the first one is really good, and then the rest of them are amazingly well structured. Just watching how they play out. I envy you.
What's interesting is I was reading an interview with Rian Johnson recently. He said he had written the pilot episode for Poker Face before he wrote Glass Onion. And now I'm thinking, I think he might have been using Poker Face as almost a proof of concept of some of the structure he uses in Glass Onion, where we get to we get so far into a situation, and then he kind of goes back and, shows us that same series of events, but from a different angle.
Yes, like what's happening behind the curtain, right?
Yeah. It's great writing. It's fun structure. I love this kind of stuff.
Well, and the structure of it is so. Like, here's the thing. I think what's interesting about it is if you watch an old Columbo episode and you watch a Poker Face episode, like, and you marvel at how the structure, the framework worked in the 70s. And it works right now. And it worked in the 70s, and it still works now. And it's what talent you're going to surround around it. Last week's episode, Judith Light and Markathia. Woo! Judith Light is not Who's the Boss, baby.
Oh, no.
They were so, they're amazing. They're like some of the best TV villains of the year. I hope they get Emmy nominations out of it, because that episode was cracking. Let's see. We got a good evening, friends from Ken.
Hey, Ken.
Glad to see you're not in any trouble tonight, Ken. Good. And then Joe wrote, "I love her in comic book villains." I love her in a lot of stuff. I love her. I love her in a lot of things.
That's a movie I haven't watched in forever.
She's really coming into her own, though. Like, she is.
Mark Hamill's in that, right?
I think so. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. There was like one or two different like indie films that came out around that time that all dealt with like comic book collectors and stuff. And I know he was in at least one of them, and I think it was this one though.
Yeah, but it's one of those. She is one of those actresses that's been around for a long time, and she's needed a little bit to find her way, right? She's one of those people that has needed to find her way. It's not. I don't know if it's Mark Hamill. So the cast I have is Donald Logue, Carrie Elways, Michael Rappaport, DJ Qualls, Eileen Brennan, Monette Mazur, Danny Masterson, and James Duval.
Okay, then I'm confusing that with something else. Then that's my
But
bad.
that's okay. But like I said, it's a good movie. But the beauty in her is that she's come into her own recently, where she started producing and her own avant-garde projects. And I will also say to you, Rich, I don't know if you saw her recently, but she is one of the 5 or 6 best late night guests going right now. Because she was on Seth Meyers. She was on, I think she was on Seth Meyers, and she absolutely floored on Seth Meyers. So, like, it's funny. We're getting into an area where every generation has their guests on late night talk shows that are gold. No matter what they come up with, they have interesting stuff. Like her whole story was about, she basically thought she grew up in the Herman Melville house. And eventually what happened was she eventually had friends at Vanity Fair who outed her. So she had friends that wrote for Vanity Fair and basically looked into her story and basically told her afterwards, hey, your story's bullshit. And so she's like, I thought I had friends. I don't have friends. She goes, apparently, Seth, at this Vanity Fair place, they have something called fact checking. And it ruined my story. And like, so it was all very interesting. But she's great. Poker Face is great. The other problem with the Iger thing, we're getting back to that, circling back. Iger also announced 7,000 layoffs today. So, and the layoffs aren't typically going to come from theme parks or manual labor positions. They're going to come from positions in the industry. So you're announcing these 3 major sequels as you're announcing 7,000 people are going to lose their jobs as a restructuring that they're trying to get $5 billion down. And that's the constant thing in Hollywood right now, is this constant talk of restructuring, moving debt. And I blame the Warner Brothers guy. He's driving me bonkers. Everything that goes wrong going forward. I like,
honestly though, everybody's been spending like drunken sailors on streaming content. And this is partly, you know, they're looking to reduce overall spending because everybody's in debt at this point. So I kind of understand this. I mean, I think, you know, what they've been doing with like, oh, we've got a completed series, but we're not going to air it now because we don't want to be paying out, you know, small amounts of residuals is ridiculous. And this is, we're gonna have some strikes this summer. I guarantee you. At this point,
because the way things are structured, and that's another thing we're going to talk about a little bit. They're leading into a writer strike because you're going to have both directors, talent behind the scenes, and writers, and even actors to a certain extent. When you go back to the Scarlett Johansson affair, right? You're going to have something in place that states, if my movie gets released in theaters, if my movie gets released to Blu-ray and 4K, if my Blu-ray gets released to direct to streaming, how am I going to profit from a hit on any of these things? Plus, you're going to also have to go, you know, how is it being sold to its own streaming service? So, like, for example, something like Black Widow, right? Black Widow doesn't go to theaters. So right there, you lose a revenue stream that she had a major part of. It doesn't go directly to Blu-ray and 4K, although eventually gets there. It goes right to Disney Plus, right? They're going to have to build into these contracts with writers, directors, and creatives the idea that you can be paid based on where your property goes, and some sort of clauses are going to have to guard some of these creators to make sure that their films and shows and whatever they do doesn't get locked away in a closet like the Scooby-Doo movie or Batgirl, right? Like there's going to have to be something in place that protects creatives, right?
Oh yeah. Studios are going to have to start paying out a lot more upfront rather than residuals. And the whole idea of residuals was a profit participation for every, key players involved, that as over time, as this thing continues to make money, they continue to have a stake that's paid to them. If that's going to be cut off by the studio because they don't want to pay residuals, then they deserve that money up front. Then, as far as I'm concerned, they're doing the work, and basically the studio's just like, we don't want to pay you. We don't think it's financially good for us to keep this on a service and you get residuals from it, but overall its existence on the service is not bringing in the money that we would have to pay you. It's a weird bit of financial.
And the scariest thing is losing the property altogether. Like shit's just disappearing and never to be seen again, theoretically, right? So they're gonna have to fix it. But on a positive, we're always gonna have James Bond films, Rich, unless you go into production in the early 90s.
or try
to go into production in the early 90s on a Timothy Dalton Bond film, and you start production and you're working on this movie that's going to eventually become GoldenEye, and production's a mess. It starts off a goddamn mess, Rich, with contracts expiring. And basically it all stems, like the whole problem with the process of this production before it gets going and eventually becomes the great Bond film that it becomes. I said it. I don't care. We can fight about it later, but the great Bond film it becomes is basically MGM goes bankrupt, right? That's the theory is MGM starts to lose its way. United Artists and MGM get into a fight. MGM UA gets bought by this other guy who basically his whole plan to buy MGM and all of its tasty artifacts is that in order for him to pay for it, he's going to sell all the residuals. He's going to sell off all the pieces of the library, including the very tempting and very tasty James Bond morsels that are located in the MGM refrigerator. And basically he's going to take that money and he's going to pay the money for the company by doing this roundabout. Like it sounds like the worst Ponzi scheme I've ever heard. And that of course causes a lawsuit, right? The Eon company that controls the rights to James Bond says, hey, this isn't what we signed up for when we made a deal with MGM and United Artists. And so litigation happens. And that causes the production.
Litigation is one of the keystones of the James Bond franchise. If everybody's happy and no one is suing anybody, I get a little worried.
Well, yeah, what's wrong with it? Why is it not coveted enough? But the interesting thing here is this whole fight over MGM and the library and with this company called Path. Basically what happens is that causes all the contracts to lapse. It causes people to get older. It causes Dalton to get there and go, I think I'm too old for this. And my contract's expired. I don't think I'm going to re-up. But one of the interesting things that happens is when they come upon this moment, Timothy Dalton's not going to be Bond anymore. So Pierce Brosnan is not Remington Steele anymore. And a bunch of other actors that sign up for the role or that could be Bond don't work out. So you have, you have directors that are coming in, you have people working around. $1.5 billion by this company called Quintex causes so much trouble with MGM UA and with the Eon Studios and Bond and everything. We lose about 5 years of Bond, right? I mean, that's essentially what happens. And by the time all the dust clears, Dalton walks away 2 bonds in. He's only made 2 instead of the usual 4 or 5. And Brosnan steps into the role, and Brosnan wins the role. He wins the role from a bunch of people.
There was including one Sean Bean.
He wins the role from the guy that eventually will play the bad guy. He also wins the role from Mel Gibson again, Hugh Grant this time, right? Coming off that right around the era of Notting Hill, and Liam Neeson, who basically was forced to give up the role, really wanted the role, but his very, very impressive wife, Natasha Richardson, said, if you take this role and ruin and upplan our lives for 10 years, we can't get married. And so Liam Neeson says, I can't do it then. So, during all this time also, they find ways to, the script changes. And because of the politics in the world changes, right? Berlin Wall occurs during this giant fight. So it opens up the door. Instead of China being the villain, which was in the original script for the Dalton version, it ends up being a post-Cold War Russia, right? And they come up with, this character of Alec Trevelyan, who is eventually going to be played by Sean Bean. But Rich, the actors that were up for this character in his other forms of this character, and who turned it down flat. How about Anthony Hopkins and Alan Rickman, Rich? How about a concept of an Alan Rickman James Bond villain that we will never get? And that's one of the
that hurts. That hurts.
Well, and the Rickman character would have been an older version of Bond, a mentor who worked at MI6, and similar in the Alec Trevelyan mileage, and both Hopkins and Rickman turned it down. Rickman, I think, reading about it, turned it down because he didn't want to do another villain after Die Hard and after Robin Hood.
That's
and he didn't. Well, it's very fair. And then you look at other stuff that he did around this time frame. He's working on Love Actually. He's working on other things. And you look at it and he goes, they're really different from what he was going to do. And I respect that. But it doesn't hurt my flavor that we could have had an Alan Rickman Bond villain.
Man.
Even a Hopkins Bond villain would have been interesting to me. But so that casting occurs. And then, the casting with Brosnan, he beats out a ton of people. And he just beats out, if Brosnan doesn't accept the role, they see this kid come in and do an audition, and the kid is Ralph Fiennes. So we could have had a Ralph Fiennes Bond, could have had a Liam Neeson Bond. And so when you're viewing these movies, like, that's the interesting thing about the Bond franchise as we do these deep dives, right? As we're doing BOND-A-THON, right? The what ifs and the what could have bees, what could be, and the what ifs. Wow, that was bad. That was
what could have been.
That was terrible English. Are so intriguing, right? Ken writes a couple things. First, he lost my account on Thursday. Sorry about that.
Oh dear,
that's rough. Dear. And I still think Gerard Butler made a good Bond in the early years, and Tomorrow Never Dies with a bit part. You know what? But Butler, here's an interesting, from that perspective, right? Butler, too old now, but Butler is a really kind of an interesting cottage industry himself. I would argue to you that Butler has made more profitable films in the last 5 years than a lot of actors, and a lot of actors have made a lot of movies. So I would tell you, Butler making his, like, when a movie like Plane grosses $40 million and it costs like 15 to make, and he's making most of that and percentages, I don't know that he wants to be Bond. You know what I mean? Like, he has his own thing. He has his own plan. But one of the things, because it of the breakdown in the Soviet Union, they get to film all around the world, including, if you can believe it, St. Petersburg. And that's one of the highlights of the film is the tank run around St. Petersburg. Production goes for about 7 months. Kind of a strenuous, heavy lifting production. And the script the script, you know, you're right. There wouldn't be a good Bond film if we didn't have fights behind the scenes. The script doctoring on this one is alarming. Like, there's 2 people credited. There's another person credited with a story who filed a thing with the Writers Guild. And then also one of the people that came up with the story, but not necessarily all the characters or things, but came up with the basic premise and everything wraparound. He basically gets a character name out of this. It's this weird thing where he gets a character name out of the concept. He becomes the Jim Wade character, the character that is played by, I can't think of his name. Joe Don Baker. Jack Wade.
Yeah,
Jack Wade is actually a writer who came up with some of the concepts for the film. And when he lost the crediting, they gave him the name of the CIA guy because they weren't going to use Felix Leiter, which is just, again, off. Right? Not using Felix or setting up Felix for Brosnan. Why wouldn't you do that?
I think not using Felix right away also makes kind of a sense in the universe, because the last time we saw Felix, he was getting his legs eaten off by sharks. I'm
sorry, I forgot that.
So I'm willing to kind of like forgive that, you know, and bringing in the Joe Don Baker character. My complaint is it's only been 2 movies since we saw Joe Don Baker play the bad guy.
It's weird.
It's
weird. But it's 2 movies. But it's two movies. But it's almost 7 years. So it's the other.
And they've done it closer in time. Charles Gray was in Live and Let Die, or not Live and Let Die. You Only Live Twice, and
then he played. Wasn't he Spectre? Wasn't he Blofeld at some point?
Yeah, he was Blofeld at another point.
Yeah.
So
I think they do it. What I would say, this is also the first Bond film, writing wise, right, where there is no Ian Fleming novel. There is no Ian Fleming novel to come up with. Now, the name is a throwback to Ian Fleming, right? Because basically he had his area in Jamaica that he wrote and lived in was always
his.
Go ahead.
His estate was called GOLDENEYE.
Called GOLDENEYE.
Kind of, flower there
that grew, right? So there are, like, because they don't have an Ian Fleming novel to work with, they're just like, okay, well, let's call it a GoldenEye and we'll go from there. And then another thing that happens on this Bond film, production-wise, this is the first Bond film where we get CGI effects, right? It's the first. It's a little bit away from practical effects, and it's also the last effects movie for a Bond veteran named Derek Meddings, who passed away, and the film is dedicated to him. I was reaching for the remote, going, when you're younger and you see these movies, you don't pay attention to dedications, and I don't know about you, but I immediately go to them now and try to figure out who the person was and what their story is, because the dedication in movies and television, they're super important. And what I would encourage you to do, if you watch a movie and it says this film is dedicated to somebody, go search that person out and just figure out about a life for a second. Because these don't grow on trees. The film dedicated to people doesn't grow on trees. And I think we've seen a lot of them with, like, Wakanda Forever and a couple of things where we know the movie's going to be dedicated to somebody, right? But when a Bond film is dedicated to somebody that was basically the heart and soul of the effects department for every major Bond film, almost all of them, and many films from the 80s, Derek Meddings, when you start doing a deep dive on that kid, he passed away right around the time GoldenEye was coming out. But listen to the films, Rich, the filmography for him. And even starting in the 70s. So you got Thunderbirds Are Go, Live and Let Die, Man with the Golden Gun, Land of Time Forgot, Shout at the Devil, Aces High, Spy Who Loved Me, Superman the movie, Moonraker, Superman 2 for your eyes only, Krull, which has fantastic special effects. Bonsai, Superman 3, Supergirl, Superman 3, which doesn't have spectacular effects. Spies Like Us, which he's also in as one of the doctors. Santa Claus the movie, High Spirits, a little movie in 1989 called Batman, Hudson Hawk, Neverending Story, and Cape Fear. He is a legend in the business that I had no concept of until this dedication, and I went on a deep dive for his stuff tonight, and it's one of the great benefits of this show. Do you know,
I think that this being like a capstone on his career is great. Yeah, we mentioned, there was a couple of little uses of CG here and there, because that was just starting out. But there's so many great practical effects shots in this film. If you listen to the commentary track on the Blu-ray release of this movie, the director and producer talk about a lot of those practical shots, like that in the beginning when after Bond, is trying to escape from that Russian facility, and there's that big long wide shot, and you see the plane going down the runway and stuff. That was shot on the back lot of the studio, and then they used a matte painting to make it look like it was in the Russian mountains somewhere, and it's flawless. It's a flawless piece of just old school practical effects work that goes all the way back to the 20s. And, it just looks wonderful. There's so much model work in this movie. He
was a miniature guy.
Yeah.
He did a lot of the miniature work.
And going around on the giant radio telescope at the end of the movie, they're switching from on-set, set stuff where they can do this safely and then still cheat it so it looks like it's on this giant place. They're shooting some stuff and one of the largest radio telescopes in the world in Puerto Rico. They're shooting some of this is model work, and the only time it's even noticeable as model work is like when some of that water is being drained out from when it looks like when the sky's lake. You can't miniaturize water. So water will always give away a model shot, unfortunately. But everything else, there's other stuff I'm looking at it going, that has to be a model shot. And
it's beautiful work. And the dedication.
There's so many practical stunts in this thing, from the bungee jump off of the dam, which was actually a dam in, I think, Switzerland. The jumping after the plane, on the motorcycle, take that, Tom Cruise. There's
that's
many things here.
We'll get to Legacy, Rich. We'll get to Legacy.
Okay. Yeah. Put a pin in what I was about to say, but we'll get back there.
But it's beautiful, and the tank chase was the largest location shoot in St. Petersburg, so they were breaking all kinds of barriers there during this production.
Was it the first time a Bond film shot in Russia?
I think it is, because it was right. Okay. It was right after the Berlin Wall fell. So we were talking about, they do in the credits, they do thank the people of St. Petersburg and everybody who helped get the filming there. But like I said, I think the most interesting side of a little bit CG. A lot of fighting backstage with regards to the script, major fighting over the brand, where it is what leads us into production. And then, they finish up the movie, and God willing and God helpful, they release it, right? So we get our next phase, which is box office. So I would say, Rich, the interesting thing here is this is the beginnings of Mega Bond. Right, this is the beginnings of the Bond that maybe when you talk about Bond with your friends, or you talk about the Daniel Craig Bonds, and you look at the box office receipts, or you look at how did No Time to Die do, and how did all these other movies do. This part of the franchise, Brosnan ushers in the era where people want to see Bond, and they want to see Bond badly, and even if the movies aren't great, because Brosnan, and this hurts me and pains me to say this. This is his best Bond, and he's got three more, and they're just not as good. And
no.
he gets a little bit unlucky with scripting, and he gets a little unlucky with casting, which is very important. Every kind of Bond, we talked about the big things. So it opens in November of 95. It earns $26 million in its opening weekend in 2,600 cinemas in the United States and Canada. In the UK, it outgrosses. It's the third biggest film release in history, behind Jurassic Park and Batman Forever. It becomes the fourth highest worldwide gross of films in 95, and the most successful film since Moonraker.
Yeah.
Weird. It's weird. That's weird.
I can understand that, though, because Bond Mania had a bit of a Roger Moore resurgence. Moonraker kind of coincided with the
Star Wars.
Everybody
it was amazing
on Star Wars thing.
It's so bad, but it's so good. It's so bad, but it's so amazingly good. So here are the numbers, Rich. Flat out numbers. So we said 26 million opening weekend.
Mm-hmm.
That ends up being 24% of the total gross. It grosses in the domestic. It grosses the first Bond movie over $100 million. So $106 million. The international box office is $249 million, almost $250 million, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
So the worldwide box office, it's $250 million in 95.
Off of a $60 million budget.
On a $60 million budget, which
people made their money.
Wow. The inflated domestic right now is 223, which would put it, like smack dab in the middle of last year's biggest hits. You know what I mean? Like upper echelon biggest hits, like only behind Doctor Strange and Jurassic Park. Only the most profitable things. So what stands out is that it opened big. It opened big, and it had a lot of screens, and it lasted almost 9 weeks in theaters, Rich, which, again, in the new era, when you last 9 weeks in theaters, that's a lot of screens, 2,600 screens for 9 weeks. It's incredible longevity for a movie that's front loaded. and where you look at it also box office wise, when you look at a $60 billion production budget, it's nothing for this movie. Mm-hmm. And the key to that production budget is that Pierce Brosnan makes $1.2 million on that production budget. Damn, he was a bargain. And
every penny well spent.
Well, that's just about the best money you can spend $1 million on, right? I mean, a actor who wants to come into his place and take it on and run with it, right? And GoldenEye, I would say, is one of those movies where he is clearly invested, and his movies degrade over time, right? His second, third, fourth movies degrade, but the first time he's Bond, he's having a blast. He knows he should be there. He's waited a long time for it. Now the other movies fail him script wise, fail him in the other thing, fail him song, fail him Bond girls, fail him villains.
Well,
it becomes. Okay.
I was holding off on this, but
yeah.
I don't think the Bond theme here is all that great at all. I think it's an incredibly forgetful turd of a song.
No.
In my opinion, we are in an incredible desert of bad Bond themes. The last good Bond theme we had at this point is A View to a Kill from Duran Duran. And the next good Bond theme we're going to get is for World Is Not Enough from Garbage. And that's still a few years away.
Yeah. It's a quagmire. And actually, that's one of the things, a critical response. One of the major problems with this particular Bond movie, right, when you're looking at it, is the score. The score is abysmal. It's It's the first time John Barry's not been back. You know, Bono and Edge write the song for Tina Turner. It plays over a wonky credit sequence that's basically about the fall of Russia. It's a weird credit.
Well,
it's nothing to do with Bond. And then
no. I would say that the idea of the fall of the Soviet Union plays into this movie because, you know, ultimately the villain is trying to use some loose nukes or a
loose
kind
weapon.
of a parallel to nuclear weapons in the form of, you know, a laser that shoots an electromagnetic pulse. So I
By the way,
think, you know,
it's not lost on me. You're making jokes, but let's face facts. It's a space laser that shoots an EMP. And I'm just saying, we've been a little bit obsessed recently with space lasers.
Well, not us, but
not us. Yeah, funny. But
crazy people have it.
Yes, Looney Tunes. Wonky. But
so
you're right. The scoring and the music is terrible.
Oh, it is, yeah.
And you only get the Bond theme once. Like I was watching it today, and I was like, did I only hear the Bond theme during? And granted, it's the best use of the Bond theme in the movie. It's the only use of the Bond theme in the movie. But the idea that the Bond theme starts when Bond comes crashing through a wall in a tank in Russia, and the Bond theme starts playing, and then the bad guys they have the girl in the car, they have Isabella Scorupco in the car, and the bad guy's like drinking like out of his flask, and Bond's chasing him and like down the street in St. Petersburg in a tank, and the Bond theme's playing. It's great, but the rest of the score is forgettable. And the song,
there are little hints of Bond music a couple of other places. We'll call it traditional Bond music. Like in the beginning, when he's right before he meets up with Sean Bean's character in the Russian facility in the opening segment, there's just very faintly on timpani that you just hear a little dum ba dum bum 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 ba bum bum. You know, it's like,
it's very slim.
A little hint. Okay, I appreciate that. I was really trying to listen to the score this time to see where it was going to go, and ultimately nowhere. But there's one or two other moments.
Nowhere. It went nowhere.
No, it didn't go anywhere. It's an immensely forgettable score. There's another moment or two where they kind of give like one of those da-da stings, and then it doesn't lead into anything.
Yeah, Eric Serra is the guy that gets blamed, right? And basically, what happened was part of it was like, I think it was twofold, right? If you're reading about it, Sarah delivered score beats, and the Broccolis looked at them and just went, "These are garbage. Go back, redo them." And then after a certain point, he just stopped giving a shit because he'd been paid a certain amount of money. Right. And he just started delivering stuff. And then they started, like, if you read about it, they start moving things around to try to cover places where they put synthesizer tracks in, they move things around. Like, you know, they try to do some traditional symphonic music, but most of it is just, they're trying to fix the Eric Serra stuff and the Eric Serra song. I think part of the reason you can blame Eric Serra so easily is that the love song is so bad that it's over the credit tracks and it's abysmal. Like, you're not going to blame Tina Turner for belting out GoldenEye, right? Written by Bono. But
it's a terrible word to try to cram into a song.
Yeah, GoldenEye. Yeah, it's weird. But you are going to blame the guy that doesn't use a lot of the John Barry score.
Yeah. Writing a Bond theme is like really tricky because, like I said, you have "and his struts like thunderball," which makes no fucking sense, but it's Tom Jones belting it out, so you buy it.
Well, and like I said, you're following in the footsteps of the Beatles. You know, you're following the footsteps of Goldfinger. You know what I mean? Like you're following in the footsteps of greatness, and you have to knock it out of the fucking park, right? And even View to a Kill at this point. That I was telling you. And again, this is for people who watch the show. I told Rich I watched A View to a Kill. The movie is abysmal. But if you're not banging your head and you're in your 40s or 50s, late 40s, early 50s, if you're not banging your head to the View to a Kill theme, I don't know. I I don't know. I can't be friends with you. And so, but you get this, and it's kind of boring. Music isn't great. But the critical response, this is one of the highest. Oh, God, sorry.
One last thought on the critical the music. We've seen other Bonds where they don't use the traditional Bond signature songs, signature tunes. I'm thinking specifically of Casino Royale. But that's a creative choice that informs the character's journey. This is that's the Bond origin story. And he doesn't really become James Bond until the end when, he shoots Mr. White in the legs and he's like, okay, buddy, I'm taking you back. And then he's like, who are you? Bond, James Bond. Bam!
Kick the music. Right. It's a choice.
That's the end of it's an incredibly great choice. Here, it's a dumb decision.
Well, here it's not a choice. Here it's a necessity because we don't have anything to do. Let's get a comment quickly. Hey, brothers. So Smithson Creative Handcrafted Woodworking, thank you for joining us. Hey, brother, yourself. We appreciate you coming. But yeah, I think the interesting thing about that is when they don't use it and you miss it and then it occurs, it has to be worthy of the moment. And it is worthy here. Like the tank is worthy.
Yeah.
The end of Casino Royale is worthy. So, but the critical response of this particular Bond is one of the highest rated Bonds of all time. Like the tomato meter on this is 80%. The audience score is 83. It's an A- cinema score. So it is like when people, I was talking to somebody in one of my groups, I think there's an old movie theater group that I'm in, movie theater ads. And they said, you're doing a show about GoldenEye. It's not that great. And I'm like, but in retrospect, it is. Like at the time, it was a big hit. Like the reviews, 3 out of 4 from our good friend Roger Ebert of the Sun Times. Who basically says that, one of the things that comes across is he's in love. Somehow, Brosnan is more sensitive, more vulnerable, more psychologically complete than any of the previous Bonds, which is an interesting kind of look. Because Brosnan does bring to the table, when he sits across from M, he does not look like the deranged man-child that Daniel Craig will be. He does not look like the bored husband that Timothy Dalton was. Right? There's an air to him that he is dangerous. And I was, the critical response was good. And so when you say, hey, I don't understand why you're thinking this is one of the best Bonds, this movie, the response now is even more pronounced as you go through.
Yeah, I think it's a great pivot point for the franchise. When you go back, remember last week we talked about The Living Daylights, which was basically, we kind of noted this is the last time Bond will deal with the Soviet Union as an actual entity. Here we're dealing with post-Soviet Russia. The idea that there's a little bit of chaos going on behind the scenes, and people are, kind of scrambling for their little bits of power here and there. And this created its own version, not the Cold War, but its own kind of tension for a little while around the world. We have the Bond franchise kind of wrestling with the idea that not just the world and geopolitical has changed from the 50s and 60s, the heyday of the literary Bond. But our attitudes towards women have vastly changed. The conversation with M, and bravo for bringing in Dame Judi Dench as the new M.
Talk about fucking gravitas, right?
Oh, God. And she flat out calls Bond a misogynistic dinosaur.
A relic of the Cold War.
And she's not wrong.
Well, and actually, and she makes him look like a pussy too. Like there's that moment where they're drinking, and he goes, "I think what your former M had cognac in the desk," and she goes, "I prefer bourbon." You whore. Like it's very much like the Trebek sketch from Jeopardy. Your mother's a whore, Trebek. It's I prefer bourbon. Just be a man. But it's a great move, right? You put her in there. And
we're going to see the franchise kind of struggling with the changing world
sexual
around
mores, the changing,
and,
the idea of Bond as a misogynistic dinosaur is.
And we're going to see it a little bit more through the Brosnan films, but again, you know, once we get another reset with Daniel Craig, that's when we're really going to see a large overhaul of some of these ideas. Some people like it, some people don't.
Well, and here's the thing, like, it's an interesting thing because when you're watching the movie, right, and you're in it, it's still a Bond film. He is, for me, watching this particular Bond film, he's a good Bond. So here are my check marks. We talked about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
We got a good Bond. How about the Bond girls? Okay. One I really like. I love Sarepko. I love her, Natalia. I think she's she's smart. She realizes how much danger she's in. She's well written. Famke Janssen, she rises to the occasion.
She has an arc through this
movie. Right. I love Famke Janssen, but it is one of the worst written Bond girls, written wise, on the page. Just a crazy chick that gets off on killing people. And it literally gets off on killing people. And has one moment where she's shooting down the entire thing of Severnaya, where she almost has an orgasm on screen. And you're just like sitting there going, this hasn't aged well. This particular character, even though she's great, like, even though she's like one of the reasons she's voted, like she's been voted the 6th best Bond girl of all time, and Sarepko is behind her at 7. One of the reasons is Janssen just runs with it.
Oh yeah,
here's what's there.
The performance so much as I'm going to fault the writing and conception of it.
Right. I would have preferred her a lethal assassin as opposed to, you know, somebody who's like, you know, in Russian bathhouses trying to squeeze the life out of people, you know, by wrapping her thighs around things. I'm like, well, yeah, okay, teach your own.
It feels like they're trying to make a joke out of kink or something like that, and I'm just kind of like, you know, maybe not.
But the performance is great. She's fucking bonkers. So Bond girls are good. Song's okay. I will say
you're being generous.
I'm being generous. I am being generous. It's okay. It is still Tina Turner singing a song, so you got to give a little Proud Mary a little respect. But what I would say where it's interesting, and it's going to jump into legacy for me, right? When we'll talk about that in a moment. This is the first Bond film one of the first Bond films, like in recent memory, they get away from it a little bit personally in License to Kill, but this one, this is somebody that Bond knows. It's somebody that Bond, you know, is friends with. And it's the first time we're going to look at, you know, and I think it's more part of legacy, but the decaying structure of MI6 and how MI6 is basically, it creates all these killers, releases them out into the world, and what happens to them, we're going to see it more in the Craigs. The legacy is there for the Craigs to get the idea that we've created a bunch of mass killers, and not everybody is James Bond, right? It works, and the plan is great. Like, it's a great plan. It has working moving parts, right? He's gonna crash the financial markets by plummeting London into the Stone Age, erasing all records.
We have lasers coming out of, you know, wristwatches and silliness like that. But ultimately, this feels like a very grounded espionage
spy film. Yeah.
Spy film. And I really do appreciate that, you know, okay, you know, and then of course it's a Bond film, so you have to have some over-the-top elements like the tank chase through St. Petersburg, which is a lot of fun. I'll admit that.
Or the train, Russian train, the crazy Russian fucking train that looks like it's out of Cold War era Russia, and it's on some track that we don't know where the track is, but Bond finds the track in 10 minutes. He puts a tank right in front of it, fires one at it, you know, like it, but it's got wonky movement in places, but it's so much fun. And I love, you know, it's really fun. And
the Russian train is from the wild, decadent West.
Well, and also it has one. I'll tell you what it does have in spades. It has weird places and people in weird places. They like the idea that you alluded to it on your name, but Minnie Driver singing "Stand by Your Man" in a Russian titty bar with a Russian mobster played by Robbie Coltrane, who will become Hagrid, is one of the weirdest. It's just a weird.
Well, first of all, Minnie Driver's still 2 years away from what I consider her breakout role in Grosse Point Blank. Okay, that's 97. This is 95. She's been doing like some British TV stuff. Like a few years before this, she had like a 3-line guest spot on one of my favorite mystery series, Lovejoy. She's been doing a lot of stuff. So the fact that she's, in the small role that she is at this point doesn't surprise me all that much. It's great that, her career then goes on to become what it is. You have Alan Cummings.
Fantastic.
He's great in this. How low of a billing does he get? He's like 8th or 9th billed in this movie, but he's so well. I mean, he's very important to the whole
he's
thing.
He's one of the best sub henchmen.
Yeah,
he's absolutely one of the best sub henchmen. Right? He's not like Trevelyan leaves. Like at one point, leaves him with like somebody guarding him and says, basically, if he moves, kill him. We're also with Minnie Driver. You're talking about Minnie Driver. Her other big breakout role was a movie called Circle of Friends, right? So she's she's a mere months away from Circle of Friends opening in U.S. theaters and across the globe, because I think it opened in Christmas of that year. So she is like, she's doing a Bond film and she's singing "Stand by Her Man," and she badly, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful.
Oh, yes.
In every conceivable way, it's beautiful. But
one other thing I want to touch on before we kind of go to legacy, and that's the thing I've kind of touched on with every single Bond movie, because as luck would have it, we've been doing the first Bond for each actor. And, I've sort of
weird coincidence, by the way, for anybody who asks, somebody brought it up and he's like, we know what you're going to be doing next week. And I said, what has happened is it's been all votes. It's been all legit. We might have a different next week because there have been votes for Skyfall, and not all for Casino Royale. Which is interesting because those are the two Craig Bonds where you look at and you go, those are the two, right? Those are like, but finish your point.
But what I found interesting was, how does each movie introduce the new James Bond? We had that great stuff in the casino in Dr. No, where we saw, little bits of, we don't get to see his face at first. We see some card playing and stuff like that, close up on his hands. And then suddenly it's that
cigarette
classic
and the sound
and thing. Yeah. We don't get George Lazenby's face right away as he's driving along and then sees Tracy getting into trouble on the beach. Then we kind of had that kind of like rather blasé Roger Moore one, which felt more like the opening to an episode of The Saint than it did a Bond movie.
Yeah, he's walking out of the airport. Yeah. It's boring. This one,
no, he's just waking up in bed. Yawn.
Oh yeah.
The Dalton one, again, that was kind of boring. This one, I mean, we see, we get an idea it could be Bond as he's trying to, running along and infiltrating this Russian base, but we don't see his face at first. We get glimpses of it during, at the end of the bungee jump and everything. But once he's inside, Martin Campbell, and the director of photography, there's a couple of shots where they really just go full on film noir, and it's like shadows except for across his eyes and stuff like that. It was some really effective, cool.
And the costuming is spot on. It's black. It's jet black. It looks amazing. It looks like a Strike Force team.
Yeah. Again, I mean, the script, it's not like the most iconic of introductions for a new actor in the role, but visually it's a big step up over the last couple.
Well, and actually it and this is where you kind of get some of the cool things about the franchise. One of the reasons you and I wanted to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I love about the franchise and the legacy and this particular Bond, I love that it leans in on the last mission trope, right? The last mission of this one is intricately important to this Bond, right? Because it will affect the choices he makes on this last mission impact the whole film, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really interesting place that they got scared of, right? They got scared of, hey, you know, if they're going to, the last mission's the last mission, that's it. Because all the other Bonds are, you know, oh, I'm just getting back from Jamaica, or I'm just getting back from, you know, the Arctic, or wherever the fuck he's getting back from. This one is, he's getting back from Russia. He lost his friend, you know, and then he, you know, it jumps to the jump cut of Monaco and the car sequence where he's, you know, romancing the psychiatrist who's, you know, trying to see if he's fucking crazy or not. He is.
I mean, I imagine there's a gap of a few years in there too.
But the legacy I'm going to say to you is, this is where I would believe that the people who made the Craig Bonds looked at this Bond and said, hey, if they can do it, we can do, people will allow him to be on a mission and have that mission impact something else. Right? Because up until this point, Bond is standalone. But this is the first time we step into the waters of, is it possible for Bond to have something impactful happen on a mission, and that impacts the new movie? And I believe that these people saw like a bunch of us saw GoldenEye, played GoldenEye, which is another legacy franchise thing. Saw GoldenEye, played GoldenEye on our N64s, and I believe that they ended up making Bond movies. And what they said was, you know what? I think we can do it where all of the Bonds can be interconnected, like the Craig Bonds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a legacy of this one. This is one of the first times where something that Bond does on a mission actually matters to the rest of the story. And that's where the Craig Bonds, they lean in full. And Brosnan doesn't get that chance again, right?
Nah.
He never gets this chance again. But I believe that what happened was GoldenEye is considered, for a lot of people, considered the best Brosnan Bond. And I posit to you that the people who are making the Bonds movies saw this one and said, hey, what if we did a whole like franchise or like a whole segment of it where all the choices he's made over time impact 5 movies? And then you get the Craig franchise, which we're going to talk about next week. And I think it's the first time it happens, because he has choices where he's dealing with Spectre or dealing with Blofeld or all those things. They come into play, or the characters and people that show up sporadically throughout his life. The sheriff from the Roger Moore ones, or Felix Leiter, but it's never like it's Felix and he's like, hey, well, this is what's happening now, right? It's never, they kind of play with it a little bit in some of them, but this is the first one where the last mission is so important, it creates a fucking Bond villain. And we make jokes about that phrasing, Bond villains, but it does. What's one for you?
I would say this is definitely the last best hurrah of the franchise before its major reinvention with Daniel Craig in about 10 years. Because you go from this to Tomorrow Never Dies, which is fine. It's got Michelle Yeoh, which is fun. It's got some interesting stuff. You're starting to see a reliance more on some of the on computer generated effects. I'm thinking like the that helicopter, a lot of the helicopter stuff with the rotor.
Yeah.
Obviously, for safety sakes, obviously that has to be a computer.
Yeah, we can't have helicopters in Hollywood. This whole Twilight Zone thing that happened.
Yeah.
Oh.
Then we get to The World Is Not Enough, which Denise Richards is a nuclear scientist. And then, Die Another Day. which could have been the death knell for this franchise, but kind of was like the close off for this initial era of Bond. If you want to look at that 30-some year run as one entire era of how they do those movies, which has a lot of differences in there. But the idea that once we get to Daniel Craig, it is such a different type of franchise than it was at any point previously. I think
yes, it is. It is a changed franchise. It is a $1 billion franchise by the time we get to Daniel Craig, and because of the hits, like all of the Brosnan movies, while they vary in quality, they're all financially successful. There's not one of them that is, and one of the stark notices about this particular Bond, and to give you an idea of how successful they are, right? I know we talked about the box office, but one of the things that came up that I was reading about was that the percentage of how much this grossed versus License to Kill. The idea that this grossed so much, like percentage wise, more than, what was the number I was looking at? 83% more worldwide than License to Kill. This is the jump right into the mega franchise that it is now become. And with that comes some negativity. I'm going to give you a negative thing. It's not negative, but first a comment from Sean Smithson, who of course has Smithson Creations handcrafted woodworking. We appreciate you. Sorry, the next Jane film is called Space Horse. Laugh out loud. I kid. But I've been reading Idris Elba is being seriously considered. Sorry, off subject. He is, but as Rich is on, and Sean, you can go back and watch some of our other Bond episodes. We're doing one Bond a week. Idris Elba is being seriously considered, of course, because he has the gravitas to pull it off. Rich and I have talked about this, though. I think he's too old.
Yeah. I don't think he's interested.
And I think he's too old, too.
His name around in the production office, but I honestly don't think he's that interested at this point.
And it's also for Idris. Idris looks at, I think he looks at it objectively. It's a young man's game. It's a 10-year commitment. And also, does he want to be the guy that has to deal with the shitheads online that are, my James Bond's not black? Which is definitely going to happen if a person of color is chosen. And it shouldn't. But does Idris Elba want to deal with that? I don't think he does. Here's a legacy that this movie starts that's kind of just not great if you're a Bond fan. Although it's fun. So the marketing aspect of this. This is the first Bond that, while his stuff has been on screen and has been cool, and you go maybe try to buy an Aston Martin because Bond has an Aston Martin, and this is the first time Bond execs get completely enraptured with marketing. So there's a Perrier thing in the center. Like, I noticed it today. There's a Perrier truck that gets hit by the tank in the center of Russia that doesn't have Perrier written in Russian. It's just Perrier, and it gets slammed, and there's a bunch of them. At the BMW, it replaces the Aston Martin. They sign a massive contract with BMW where the product placement gets out of hand. And as we progress through the Brosnan bonds and the Craig bonds, the product placement has gotten worse. So it's now like Omega divers wristwatches. It's what type of fucking vodka he drinks. It's all of these things. Grey Goose,
champagne.
Yeah, so it is a negative. It is not a positive that you're tying your character, because for me, what I think is fascinating is all of these product placements happening because everybody wants to be associated with Bond. And where it's interesting to me is that Bond is the reason that he made the products cool, right? It's not that you saw Bond driving an Aston Martin and you were, Aston Martin is being driven by Bond. It's Bond driving an Aston Martin. Yeah. And that makes the Aston Martin cool. Not somebody paying a ton of money and driving people around in BMWs at concert events and screenings that makes it cool. And I think that it loses its luster a little bit. Now, on the side note, It is the single greatest use of a movie property in video game history. It is GoldenEye, the video game, is one of the greatest video games ever made. They just released it on Xbox this week and PlayStation 5. So you can play a very terrible, very hard game that doesn't look great on with up-to-date graphics. It doesn't have up-to-date graphics. It's all like people are boxy and you shoot them and they kind of just, and then they stand back up. And it's amazing. But this particular video game, the legacy of this video game is that this video game created sequel Bond video games. So, and they take all of the things from the movie. Everything is like modified out, but it's basically the structure of the movie is the same. You have to do all the different missions. It starts with the Archangel mission at the beginning where you have to infiltrate a Russian base. And this game is one of the greatest legacy things for a Bond movie ever. Like, it's Aston Martin-ish. And you have a whole series of people who became Bond fans because they sat in a room of somebody's basement with a Nintendo 64 controller, which was, by the way, fucking huge and hard to wield, and play and try to kill each other as Oddjob or with a golden gun or, you know, as Jaws. And that was their introduction to the Bond franchise. And I just find it fascinating that this movie produced that game and that game is still being talked about to this day in 2023. We haven't had a Bond game sell as good as that one, or almost any other movie franchise game sell as good as that one. I mean, we were on the precipice of having a big one this week with the Hogwarts Legacy coming out, right? Because that's going to be a video game inspired by the Harry Potter franchise. But we've nothing comes close to GoldenEye. It's one of the greatest legacies in the history of the Bond franchise.
I'm gonna take your word on that because I'm not a video gamer.
You never played ever?
The last console I owned was an Intellivision. Okay.
You had an Intellivision too?
Yeah.
So did I. That's amazing. Stampede?
Yep.
Catching the little things with the rope.
Pitfall.
Oh my God, Pitfall Harry. Still waiting for a Pitfall Harry movie. Still waiting for a Pitfall Harry movie. Haven't gotten that shit right. Getting a fucking Mario movie, but no Pitfall Harry movie. How's that?
Here's my Burger Time. Here's my Burger Time movie.
Burger Time would be great. Or the Mario Kart that they just did for The Last of Us on SNL, which was the best skit from last week. But what about you? You got another legacy item for this particular Bond?
I think this is a high watermark for their use of practical effects. Like I was saying before, we're going to see more, digital stuff as time goes on until we hit the invisible car in Die Another Day, which is so fucking stupid. I'll say it. I don't care.
Well, and this is also this is the last incarnation of Bond that is also still the dinosaur, right? I mean, because when we get to Craig, he has problems mentally as a character, but he's not necessarily the misogynistic dinosaur. Actually, he's probably the most vulnerable version of Bond that we've ever seen with regards to actually getting fundamentally attached to people he shouldn't get attached to. Mm-hmm. But this is the last Bond that, there's a sequence in the middle of the movie that's really great. And the reason why I really like the Natalia character and the Sorubko performance, where there's a sequence in the middle where somebody has a gun to her head and Bond's like, I don't care. Do what you got to do. She means nothing to me. And later on, they mimic it with her saying the same thing to him. But she's doing it to the wrong person. She's doing it to Trevelyan. And Bond kind of looks at her like, no, he'll fucking kill me. Please don't say you're attached. Say you're attached and you need to give him the codes. And I just found that really funny because it's still the misogynistic dinosaur in the Brosnan ones, right? He's still at his core, killing people and drinking, vodka martinis, shaken not stir. By the time we get to Craig next week, whatever Craig we get, Casino Royale or Skyfall, he is a different version of the character that is given to us by a very great performance.
To be fair, though, I could never see the Pierce Brosnan James Bond slap a female coworker on the ass and say, "Move along, man talk."
True.
So
that's a good point. Let's see.
I think the repartee between him and Moneypenny is great here because she's a lot more suggestive than she usually is.
Well, and she's coming from a date. That's a great little moment. Like, just so we're clear, I don't live for moments when the world's in danger and I get to see you. I was on a date at the theater, by the way. And then he says something else and he's like, what would I do without you, Moneypenny? She's like, one day you've actually got to come through on some of these innuendos. Like, you actually have to put up or shut up. And so that's one thing. The legacy here also, it can't go without saying. We have a couple things. Hold on. Let's see. Heineken too. Yeah, Heineken is a big one. Again, because he drinks vodka. He drinks vodka martinis. Fucking ridiculous. Like, I don't want him drinking Heineken. I don't want him drinking what some Euro douche is drinking at a New York nightclub. I had a ColecoVision. Yes. Also a great system. We're gonna have to play GoldenEye sometime, Rich. I'm gonna have to show it to you. Sean writes, you ever have a Vextrex console? I mean, I had to change a plastic screen on it for each game cartridge. I did not, and I'm glad I didn't have to change a screen. That sounds terrible.
I've heard of those. I've never seen one in reality.
I've never, because I feel like that'd be the kind of thing that you buy. And for us, maybe Sean, maybe Ken, definitely Joe. You remember when you used to think about buying video games where your parents would say it's going to ruin the television? And so they'd be like, you can't get it. And so the Vectrex, if you're changing screens, that sounds like something would happen. The last great legacy I want to talk about, and the franchise viability, the choice of making Judi Dench M can't go without saying. What a major change for the franchise is. Because she's so good, she gets to come back for the Daniel Craig Bonds, which is great, but also she's so strong in these movies. Her first sequence of Bond is actually one of the best uses of the M character. Up until this point, the M character is like kind of like the chummy, do what you got to do, Bond, save the world, yada, yada. But her thing where she's like, if you don't think I will send you to die because that's what you want, I have no problem doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to do it on a whim, right? She has gravitas. She puts him down. I'm a bourbon girl. Like it's like, it's phenomenal. And there's so much power in her entrance, right? You have a bunch of you have Bond talking about his gut feeling on something. And the guy's like, oh, I think you should have went after it. And it would have been fine if not for the analytical woman in charge. Yeah. And she just appears as a shadow behind Bond. And she's like, are you talking about me? And the guy's like, no, I'm not talking about you at all. She's like, yeah, whatever. It's
that classic joke of where somebody talks shit about somebody and he goes, they're right behind me, aren't they?
They're right behind me. Well, but she's got so much gravitas in those scenes. She's got so much gravitas. And when you look at the legacy of it, like, they allow her to build. She has great scenes in all of the Brosnan Bonds. And then when she gets to the Daniel Craig Bonds, she has the misogynistic dinosaur thing is totally revamped and totally changed for Craig, because Craig is just an idiot youngster, right? So she gets to revamp that, and she gets virtually the same scene, but with Craig and different circumstances. That he's embarrassed MI6, and that basically the MI6 concept, that he's embarrassed MI6 and that he's a young hothead who needs to get his shit together, right? Which is totally different from the Brosnan one. Mm-hmm. And there's
the scene I'm thinking of mostly from Casino Royale is after that whole parkour sequence and he blows up the embassy of the foreign embassy and everything, and she comes out of the hearing with the ministers. And she's just like bitching up a storm about Bond. And then she finally goes, Christ, I missed the Cold War.
She's great. She's fantastic. And also the legacy of keeping her. And one of the things I think is a legacy from this film. So not only do you have the sequence at the beginning that sets up the rest of the movie, which I think the people who end up producing the Craig films basically come in and say, hey, we can do a whole sequence of movies that are tied together, right? Which becomes Daniel Craig's legacy, lasting legacy. But you also have, this is the first film where MI6 is not some chummy guy that either disagrees with Bond and makes mistakes or disagrees with Bond and gets killed. This is the first time, again, we were talking about earlier, MI6 is a dangerous organization that creates killers, and those killers are going to be somewhere out in the world, and not all of them are going to have the moral compass that James Bond has. And I think this is the first film to do it, and I think the Craig films really launch into it. And they really, I think that somebody watched this movie as a younger writer or director, maybe our the amazing, I'm going up on the name, Sam Mendes. That's it. Maybe the amazing Sam Mendes watched this movie and watched a bunch of other Bond movies and said, hey, we can do a whole story, linear storytelling with Bond across several movies, and we can make MI6 the bad guy in 2 or 3 of them. And it all stems from the opening of this movie. And I just think it's one of the reasons why everybody loves this Bond, right? It's because it's personal, it's messy, and it's great. Well, that is a great place to end for tonight.
Yes, it is.
It really is. So we have a couple things to go over before we end. So we have one Bond week left in BOND-A-THON 2023. We're then going to an Oscar themed thing that we're doing, Oscars through the decades, and we're going to talk about that soon, probably next week. Better. But what I want to talk about tonight really quick is on the Indie Escape Network and in the Loud Nerdy group, we have a poll up. And here's the poll choices. These are great posters, by the way. They're some of the best posters online, and it's just absolutely astounding how amazing these posters are. I tried to pick the best ones, but they're all similar in how they're produced. So you can either pick Casino Royale, 007. I love the 007 stuff. You can pick Casino Royale. You can pick Quantum of Solace. Please don't. You can pick Skyfall. You can pick Spectre. Or you can pick No Time to Die. And an interesting thing that happens here legacy-wise. So the Brosnan films will lean in on their posters to the women that are in the movie with him. The Craig Bonds are all about Daniel Craig. Like, if you look at Casino Royale, you look at Quantum of Solace, they're all like, he is the focus, and he becomes a bigger star because of it, and he makes the franchise, it sets franchise to new heights. So Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre, or No Time to Die. Which one do you choose? It's all on the Indie Escape Network page, and it's also on Loud Nerdy, the group, and a couple other places. Find a place to vote in the comments. Let us know which one you want to see. That's first. Where can people find out stuff about you, Rich Drees?
Well, I've got a couple places. Most all of my writing can be found at FILMBUFFonline.com. I also do a second podcast with my very good friend, my best friend, actually, Natasha Bogutsky. It's called the Big Picture Podcast. Our most recent episode dropped about 2 weeks ago, almost now. It was about the this year's Oscar nomination. So if you want some analysis of that, I would humbly suggest giving it a listen. That can be found at thebigpicturepod.com or on the link at filmbuffonline.com. I'm also a member of the Philadelphia Film Critics Circle, and our latest podcast, The Film Scribes, just dropped on Monday, in which I talk about the Vera Drew movie, The People's Joker, and the new M. Night Shyamalan film called Knock at the Cabin. That's part of the roundtable discussions for both of those films. Took me a moment to remember what the second half of that was.
Yeah, you're on fire there for a second. Then you're like, what the hell am I talking about?
And you can find me on the Twitter at FilmBuffRich.
You can find me online at JW the Movie Guy on Facebook. Also JW the Movie Guy on Twitter. You can find me in the Loud Nerdy group. You can also find me on Wednesday nights at 8 doing Loud Nerdy the podcast, which is on all the usual suspects for podcasts. We also have a great network, and I did forget to put up the network stuff today, but we have a great I totally forgot about it. We got excited about stuff. But we have a great upcoming live streams on the Indie Escape Network where you can find us both on Twitter and YouTube. YouTube here. The YouTube Indie Escape Network channel has all of our shows. Plus, it has all these great new shows. And some of the, we have the new people that are doing a great show called The Sticky Microphone, which has a lot of great actors coming in. And we're super excited about welcoming them to our network. Also, Symbolistic Cynicism on Tuesday nights. Really great show. A lot of industry stuff. And the end of the night on Sunday night coming up this week. A lot of good stuff coming up. Genevieve Rossi coming up this week. So we got a lot of great things coming up on the network. And you can find us on both Facebook and YouTube, which is fantastic.
And you can go back through all the past shows on YouTube as well.
Right. Exactly, Rich. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, listening to our show. Thank you for paying attention to us. Thanks for being, fans of the network and fans of us. We appreciate it. Have a great week. We'll see everybody next week for Daniel Craig. Bond. Which one will it be? Who knows? I don't know.